Get started. Welcome to the closing general session of the VACo's 85th annual conference. As an elected official, I know that I am always looking for encouragement and insight about how to really excel in good governance, how to work across the aisle, and how to stay true to the principles I hold dear. None of this is easy, but it is vital to our work. Because of that, I'm very excited about our next and final session, where we're going to hear two of Virginia's most experienced elected officials discuss how they maintain their pursuit of the good throughout their many years in elected office. Today we have with us, Tom Davis, the attorney and former member of Congress, and Jim Moran, also a former member of Congress, as well as the professor of practice at Virginia Tech, both of whom will share some of the lessons of statesmanship they learned while in office. In the middle there we have with us Mark Rozell, founding dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, who will be facilitating this discussion and sharing some of his thoughts as well. I would like to offer a special thank you to Dean Rozell for his work in helping us create this session. And now please welcome Tom Davis, Jim Moran, and Mark Rozell. Y'all give them a big hand.
All right, let's get started. We just had an election in Virginia, and I thought we should talk a little bit about what happened and where we go from here. So I have Jim Moran to my left and Tom Davis to my right. That was not on purpose. So, but I'm very comfortable.
Comfortable with that.
You're comfortable? Okay, thank you. I'm comfortable in the middle, nonpartisan, dean of a public university, public policy school. That's what it has to be. I think I'd like to start and ask each of these gentlemen, what is your key takeaway from the Virginia election? The prognosticators were saying that the Senate's probably going to go Democrat, but the House could go either way. The projections were really wrong. People thought that the Democrats would give some seats back from the 2017 election cycle, where they probably picked up some seats in districts that reliably had been Republican. And then we have this sort of big national context overriding everything. So I'll let the two of them start and talk a little bit about what happened and why, and then we'll follow from there.
Well, I was stunned, but pleasantly so, because I'm a Democrat. I was hoping that the Democrats would take over control, but in the last election in 2017, there were a lot of folks whose election would have been improbable only maybe 5 or 6 years ago, really. When the first transgender woman, for example, was elected, a lot of people thought, well, that's got to be a one-off. That's accidental, because that's it's just so out of the mode of Virginia politics. And the number of women who were elected. So I've watched Virginia politics now for, I guess, almost 50 years, since I moved here in my early, about 20 years old. And I've been stunned by the rapid transformation, really, political transformation. All of the women that were elected were re-elected. Danica Roem was re-elected relatively handily. A lot of new generation Americans, first or second generation, who would not have felt at home in the Virginia General Assembly even certainly 2 decades ago, they feel very much at home right now. So Virginia is a state now that I think is a harbinger of things to come. In 1990, 1 out of every 28 Virginia citizens were born outside the United States. Now it's 1 in 10. The economic growth has played a factor. The number of households whose income is over $150,000 a year has grown at 3 times the population rate. the excellence of our higher education system has attracted a lot of people who have chosen to be very much engaged in the political system. And I have to say, as a Democrat, Donald Trump is the gift that just keeps on giving to the Democratic Party. I mean, it's, you know, it used to be that once you get elected, no matter how hardcore your base was, you set about widening that base, trying to expand the tent. And that's not the way he's going about it now. You know, maybe he's smarter than we are. Maybe he's calculated the Electoral College better than I have. That's certainly possible. But, you know, it just doesn't seem to me that the less educated rural white men is a growth stock in this country. I can understand why Hillary was not elected. She didn't reach out. She didn't take or at least express the attitude through her campaign that everybody counts. I remember a story, I'm not sure how true it is, but I'll just leave you with this anecdote that I just can't get out of my mind for a number of reasons. And until somebody tells me it didn't really happen, I'm going to continue to repeat it because it seems to reflect a whole lot. I'm Catholic. I grew up in a kind of an insular Catholic background up in Massachusetts. Pretty conservative, middle class, but generally speaking, democratic, because immigrants at that time were more likely to be democratic. Certainly the Irish and Italians were. So I could relate to this, that just before St. Patrick's Day, there is there's a dinner at Notre Dame. And you can relate to this, Jeff McKay. I think that there's a dinner at Notre Dame, and it seems ever since Franklin Roosevelt, they do it every 4 years, they invite a presidential candidate, and they pick a presidential candidate. Every single time that presidential candidate who has been chosen to address the Monsignors, the bishops, the cardinals, you know, the hierarchy is pretty much a patriarchy, the Catholic Church, they've always won, without fail. It's uncanny. Reagan twice, Bush 43 twice, Bush 41 once, Clinton twice, Obama twice. It's uncanny. I'm sure there is a correlation. So this Monsignor calls Bill Clinton, and he said that, you know, I'm calling because we want Hillary to speak to our dinner before St. Patrick's Day. And of course, Bill knew exactly what it meant, and he was just overjoyed because he knew the impact of that. And so he accepted for her, is the way I'm told the story. And then he called the campaign and said, you know, I was told that you have an RSVP to the invitation, and they have to print their program, so they need a confirmation, but Hillary was invited to speak, I think it was March 16th in Notre Dame, and he was told by somebody in the campaign, I have a suspicion who it was, but I don't want to say it publicly, they said, well, we will be declining that invitation because the Catholic white male is not one of our target groups. So that's a killer. Everybody's a target group. I mean, that's the point that I think Tom and I both want to make. We're all in this together. And if we really want to govern, we need to care about everybody, even if we disagree with them, to understand why we disagree with them and vice versa. We want to empathize with their perspective on life. we want to bring people together. We want to heal the divides. We want to move forward. We want to make the case that the best social program is a good job. We want to make the case that this is a nation of immigrants. We want to make the case that what we should really be striving for is a better life for our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren, because that's how a country remains strong and resilient. And we're now in a situation where there's this massive divide, but I suspect that what happened last week is an indication of the direction in the direction in which the future is headed. And I'm kind of proud that Virginia is on the cutting edge of that political transformation.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you. I have an edited book out last year called Catholics and Politics After the 2016 Elections, and we untangle actually the critical role that the white Catholic vote played in the outcome of the presidential race, looking at the critical states, and it was very, very impactful.
Michigan,
actually.
Pennsylvania was so the Catholic vote voted for Trump.
Yes.
More than many people.
And actually, it was the first election cycle since the 1970s where the Catholic vote and the popular vote did not go together. The popular vote went to Hillary Clinton. The Catholic vote actually went to Donald Trump. And in the key states, it was critical to the outcome. So, okay, back to Virginia. Thank you. And Tom Davis, your take.
First of all, let me say I'm a former member of the VACo board, and I'm just happy to see Penny Gross here, who has the seat on the Board of Supervisors I held in Mason District, and Jeff McKay, who's the new chairman of the county board, which I held briefly before I got out in time. I left undefeated and undefeated, just so I can run into office. And the county's still a great run county. But as we were talking before this, our demographics in Fairfax have changed markedly over the coming years. And even when I was in Congress, members in the House would come up to me and say, Davis, why are you doing this? Why are you voting this way? And I'd say, folks, this is coming to a precinct near you. The demographics are changing. You need to stay ahead of the curve. And many of them didn't because they were in safe districts. The only race that matters to most of these folks is the primary election. And the primary voters are a thin ideological slice of the electoral pie. And the country's moved apart. It's a combination of three things. It's the single party districts. It's the fact that the way people receive their news today is this way. Or cable news, if you watch Fox and MSNBC, you know exactly what I'm talking about. But here, the crap to content ratio coming over the internet is just exceptionally high. People just tune in to get their worldviews validated, and they're walking around in these bubbles. I gave a speech in Arlington, and I was saying basically that if you live in a county with a Whole Foods, it probably voted for Hillary Clinton, and if you live in a county with a Cracker Barrel, it probably voted for Trump. And this lady says, don't you mean Crate and Barrel? And I just simply I said, I rest my case. I mean, you're in bubbles. And then, of course, the money in politics has moved away from the parties to these, at the national level, not so much in Virginia, now to these super PACs who are ideological enforcers for people who dare cross the party line on anything. So we have devolved into what I call parliamentary behavior now. It starts with the voters who are voting party, not person, and that's what we've seen in these races. Quickly, Virginians took the House of Delegates for three reasons. One, they had a very good court decision out of the Fourth Circuit that the Supreme Court didn't touch. Republicans had gerrymandered, and then the courts went back the other way and gerrymandered it the other way. This is the new cycle. We're going to see more and more of this moving to the courts, and I think that was about a 4-seat gain for the Democrats. Secondly, they had a huge spending advantage in the House of Delegates down the stretch. It just outside of Hugo's race in Fairfax. See, I said, Tim, it costs a lot of money just to lose him. I mean, he spent like $1.3 million a month. But by and large, Democrats had a lot more money than Republicans as well, and they're just better organized. You control the governor's mansion. The transactional money tends to go to that party. And finally, demographics, which, as we see with a lot of newcomers coming into Virginia, the Democrats have together what I call a coalition right now that is organized. It's against Trump. They know they don't like Trump. Once you get beyond that, it's pretty dissonant. And coalitions in politics are not static, so I'm not sure that this is the future. It is as long as Trump is president, because these groups don't like him or his policies or his personality. But once he goes, what we find in Virginia is we tend to go, we're a counter-cyclical state, we tend to vote against the president, and that's happened in most of our governor's races, and trends can move pretty quickly. So let's substitute Elizabeth Warren for Donald Trump, and you'll see maybe moving back the other way. And the reason for that is the largest group in American politics are independents. But they don't vote in primaries for the most part. In some states they're forbidden and in other states they just don't. I mean, if you want to participate in the Republican nomination process, you've got to go to a convention. Has anybody here ever been to a state Republican convention? Yeah, it's like a Star Wars bar scene. I mean, you walk into the place, you have to take like 2 days off and go to Richmond. Only the really hardcore believers will do that. We used to say liberals and conservatives have passion, moderates have lives. But we've seen the Republican base basically migrate from the country club to the country, and it's become a much more rural party. So Virginia's it's not a one-party state, it's really two one-party states when you look at it. But right now, in the suburbs, the Democrats hold the upper hand today. And it's a combination of more and more ethnic voters who tend to vote more as a bloc against Republicans. I don't think that's permanent, but it's certainly true right now with President Trump in the White House. I mean, and that's part of it. And the other part of it is that educated white suburban voters at this point, particularly women, don't like what they see coming out of the White House, and they're voting votes of protest. Now, this isn't permanent. I mean, again, who knows where the Democrats come out? We went through our Tea Party phase in the Republican Party. Democrats are now going through what I call a herbal Tea Party. They have groups moving it the other way. In the old days, when the Republicans nominated Goldwater, Johnson moved to the middle of the road and got 60% of the vote. When Democrats nominated McGovern on the left, Nixon moved to the middle road and got 60%. Now you move somebody over on the wing and the other party moves not to the center, they move the other way. And the center in American politics is basically gone. And we'll see how this sorts out. But it was a good year for the Democrats. I think a lot's going to depend on how they act in the majority. What do they do with some of the key? They're going to obviously enact some of the issues they campaigned on. What happens to right to work, these kind of issues. Do they overread their mandate, which parties tend to do? And we'll see where it goes from there.
Thank you. So, in traditional academic literature and political science, we were always told that local elections are really about local personalities and issues, and that the national media try to nationalize local elections too much and try to interpret some sort of broader meaning to collections of many smaller elections than really is the case. But I'm wondering if something different is going on now. Have local elections, such as in Virginia, become proxies for a larger national ideological battle with all the outside money coming in and everybody looking at this and saying, wow, it's the Trump factor, the gift that keeps giving, as Jim Moran said. And it's the ideological battle between the parties that's driving these local races.
So let me start. I'll start first this time. It goes back to what I said before. Voters are finding less ticket splitting today than at any time in American history. For example, of the 50 state legislatures, only one has a divided House and Senate. And that's Minnesota, has a Republican Senate and a Democrat House. Every other state, it's across the board. People are not voting local anymore. They're voting at legislative elections. Governorship's a little bit different, but people are voting the party, not the person. So when members get elected, they come to Washington, for example, or they come to Richmond, and they behave as a party. Voters are making this like parliamentary voting. They come to Richmond or to Washington and behave the same way. That means that the president's party or the governor's party becomes an appendage of the executive branch, and the other party, instead of being a minority shareholder, they're now the opposition party. And that's the way it doesn't work very well, because we're not a parliamentary structure. We're a balance of power structure, but it hasn't worked very well. And I think that's really the conundrum. I mean, just the proof is, I look at the Menendez race last time in New Jersey. This guy had criminal indictments, ethics out the kazoo, and very weak candidate. Underwater in every poll, he wins by 10 points, because the voters of New Jersey would have rather had Schumer as the majority leader. They understand than they would have had Mitch McConnell. People understand now the way this stuff works. And it's been evolving that way for 20 years, but we're seeing that on a pretty consistent basis now. I don't say candidates don't matter. You have some really fine candidates running. Dan Helmer in Fairfax, Rhodes Scholar, war veteran, really good candidate. But basically, these are parliamentary elections at this point.
I agree. I think it's,
I fear for the direction that politics has taken in this country. I think it starts at the national level. Gerrymandering has been a major factor. As Tom said, if you're in the Congress, if you're a Democrat, you're always looking over your left shoulder to make sure that you have satisfied labor, NARAL, and sometimes environmental groups, whatever the constituencies are that are guns and so on, the major cultural issues that divide this country. You're always looking over your shoulder to make sure that you've got the right record so that you're not challenged in a Democratic primary. And in fact, a lot of senior Democrats, no matter how effective, are being challenged this time around. Richie Neal, a very progressive, now chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, in terms of committee structure, the most powerful position you can have. And yet he's going to be challenged by the mayor of Holyoke because the mayor is younger and supposedly more progressive and has this, a Peace and Justice Party, or that AOC's kind of is the face of. It's not healthy. So you can't really afford to vote your conscience very often. You can't afford to take a balanced position. You have to make sure that you're keeping the left satisfied. And on the right-hand side, we have seen that in spades most recently. They can't afford to speak out against Donald Trump because it's Trump supporters who are going to populate the Republican primary. And as long as, in most districts, as long as you get through the Democratic or the Republican primary, the general election really isn't competitive. That's not healthy. Tom oftentimes has made the point that for the first time, really, in generations, it occurred a few years ago for the first time, but it's still the case. The most conservative Democrat is considerably more liberal than the most liberal Republican. There's a wide chasm that didn't used to exist. There used to be what was called boll weevil Democrats who would oftentimes vote with Republicans. So beyond gerrymandering, though, money. I think the Citizens United decision was a terrible decision to suggest that corporations should be treated as though they're individuals when their sole motivation, and legally, ethically, their sole motivation is to maximize profit. And so, particularly people who own large corporations, they can invest, and I say invest deliberately, enormous sums of money through lots of ways of getting around the traditional campaign finance laws in individual candidates. But they normally don't care how well that candidate serves the interest of their congressional district. They care how they vote on taxes and on regulation that directly affects their industry. That's not healthy. And then the media, they're echo chambers, as Tom suggested. If you're a Republican, you're going to check out the Drudge Report in the morning. You'll probably get the Washington Times. You're going to turn on Fox News. You're going to listen to WMAL up in Northern Virginia. It depends upon whatever region you're in. And if you're a Democrat, you're going to wake up to the Washington Post. You're going to turn on MSNBC. You're going to listen to public radio probably during the day when you're riding. And so you have your beliefs reinforced all day. So it creates a sort of political tribalism. It's not healthy. And there were other things that contributed as well. And I think, President Obama was as much at fault as any other presidents, although I don't think it was deliberate. But just a small thing, but you're a legislator, you know what I'm referring to. We used to have earmarks in the Congress And it was a way to get legislation done. I had started this new Democrat coalition in the 90s during the Clinton administration, and we wanted to get some trade bills through, the balanced budget, welfare reform, a whole lot of stuff. And we really weren't getting more than 50 or 60 Democrats. And we'd have oftentimes, on some of that, more Republican than Democratic votes. So he'd call at night on occasion, and he'd say, Jimmy, I can't repeat what his accent. Sometimes I can after a couple of drinks, but not in the morning. And he'd be munching popcorn. I don't know what else he was doing. He was a multitasker. But the fact is, he'd ask, what are the votes? And you need to know. And, well, how are we going to get them? And so, oftentimes, we would earmark things that, they were perfectly legitimate for a school, a road, a bridge, whatever, in the congressional district of the person whose vote we needed. That had gone on for 200 years. And so the member can come back to their constituency and say, you may disagree with that vote, but I want you to walk over to the school and look at the money we got for that school, and you tell me which was more in your interest. But that was taken away, and President Obama said, any bill that has an earmark in it, I will veto. Well, he never got a regular appropriation bill in 8 years. Sometimes you have to step out of civics class and deal with real politics. And a lot of real politics is give and take. And I don't think we're focusing enough on what our individual constituencies need, the kind of the bread and butter issues, the kitchen table issues that really matter. When we had this tax cut, much of which went to buying back stock to make the top executives even wealthier, the corporations that bought back that stock. Instead of doing that, if we had put that into infrastructure, if we had had revenue sharing with the states and the localities, if we had built up our physical infrastructure, we would have had the same correlative effect on our human infrastructure. We're not reinvesting enough in the things that matter to most Americans, whether they be conservative or liberal or Republican or Democrat, and we've got to get back to that.
Tom, you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a couple things. Jim and I fundamentally agree on the earmark issue. A, it's a congressional prerogative, the power of the purse. B, it helps you pass things because members want to get to yes, and you dangle something out. It's a small piece of the spending. You set your spending cap, so it doesn't increase anything. It's just how that money is allocated. And third, it allows members to personalize their districts instead of devolving into this parliamentary behavior that we see today. So I think Congress getting rid of that was a huge mistake. Members want to bring it back, but they're not sure how to bring it back at this point. And I think that's hurt. Look, I survived in my district in 2006, big Democratic wave here. Districts like mine were going, but Penny, when I walked down the streets of Mason, I was Mr. Woodrow Wilson Bridge, right? I was the guy who got money for the Mason District Little League. I mean, people could personalize it, and they'd forgive some of my other votes because I was doing things that affect their lives. And we've taken that away. On the Citizens United issue, Jim and I have a different tact on that. I think it was rightly decided, simply because this was a movie made by a corporation, a not-for-profit corporation, about Hillary Clinton at election time. And the court said, yes, you can make a movie about a political figure at election time. Their theory was corporations can't do this. Look, free speech is most precious. Newspapers could write editorials and so on. So I think it was rightly decided. What happened was a subsequent case called Speech Now, case in the DC Circuit, established super PACs, and it's gone goofy. But what's happened is basically time and technology have overtaken that case. Who are the largest fundraisers right now? It's Donald Trump, it's Bernie Sanders, and it's Elizabeth Warren. How are they raising their money? Online. It's not huge corporate contributions. Online contributing, again, it strikes the passions. It probably helps the right and the left at this point. But I think the Citizens United thing has been overblown at this point and overtaken by events as more and more campaign spending is coming online. Act Blue has been very, very helpful for Democrats where people can give online. And so I think it's a boogeyman that's thrown out there. But I think the case was rightly decided.
Okay. Let me turn now to the future of the political parties. And I'll pose the question for both of these gentlemen and then let them talk in turn. For Tom, the Republicans, they had 2/3 of the lower house in Virginia 4 years ago. They are now the minority. Massive shift in the Trump era. Seems like the Republican Party's been really wiped out in Virginia, all over the place. My question is, how do they get it back? What does the party need to do to reestablish itself and move forward? And then for Jim Moran, my question is, do the Democrats possibly overread the meaning of their mandate from these elections, push too far, and put themselves in a vulnerable position going forward? What are the dangers for the Democrats feeling just a little bit too big right now about the meaning of their elections? Because political parties all the time misread their mandates in elections. And feel free to disagree with the premise of that, of course. So we'll go intern, Tom and Jim.
So, Jim, I ran into Mike Ross at the airport a couple of years ago. Mike was a congressman, very able Democratic congressman from Arkansas. He had run for governor and lost. And I said, how are things going? He said, well, Tom, let me tell you, he said, in Arkansas, when Obama was elected, 3 of the 4 House members were Democrat. Every statewide office holder, including both the senators, were Democrats. And the legislature, each house was 2/3 Democratic. He said today, 8 years later, he said both houses are 2/3 Republican. Every statewide office holder is a Republican, and all 4 members of the House are Republican. Basically, what you've traded off, as I said, the Republican base has become a much more rural base. Republicans very strong there. Not much hope of Democrats coming back in these rural areas. We can have a lengthier discussion over why that is. But in Virginia, given the particulars of our demographics and the growth in Northern Virginia and the Richmond suburbs and Tidewater, those coalitions now work to the Democrats' effect. I think that the thing that unites the Democrats right now is opposition to President Trump. They may not agree on everything else. They have their own internecine warfares. And if he were to lose, or when he goes, then the question is what happens to the party. And as I said before, this is kind of a counter-cyclical state, so let me give you a scenario. Donald Trump is defeated, Elizabeth Warren is president. Pick your person, I'll just pick her for right now because she's my favorite punching bag. And you have a governor's race the next year. Terry runs, McAuliffe runs again for governor, Republicans run, let's say Rob Whitman or somebody of stature. And all of a sudden, they're going to find out that the wind that was at their back before is all of a sudden in their face. Republicans we do best when we're out of power. We're not very good at governing. In fact, neither party is very good at governing. But we're a great out party. We're great critics. And I think that kind of brings it back, and the battleground will be the suburbs again. The suburbs are an area that are culturally more progressive than the rest of the state, or more liberal, or whatever term suits you. But economically, these people make a lot of money. And they don't like it being wasted, and you find sometimes tax increases and those kind of things, they can get ornery pretty quick. So I don't think it's the death knell for Republicans. We've heard this before. They have, unfortunately, nominated a series of candidates that are unelectable statewide. The Cuccinelli race, Republicans had everything going for them, but they had a really bad ticket. And the whole ticket went down. They almost elected Obenschein's Attorney General, remember that year. But you had Obama in the White House, but you had a Republican Lieutenant Governor not supporting the Republican Attorney General for governor. You actually had a split party after that convention. You had a government shutdown coming in October, and you had McAuliffe, who spent a ton of money, an able candidate, came by and squeaked to win. So it's still a competitive state, but as long as it's nationalized at this point, the coalitions within the state augured for a Democratic majority.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, since I'm a Democrat, I think Tom is right. If Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, I don't think that's likely. I don't think that scenario necessarily plays out if Joe Biden is the nominee. And I will say something of an aside, but I guess it might be worth explaining that I think that the Democrats' approach to health care, universal, federally paid health care, is a killer politically. You can't take your health insurance from 167 million people. For one thing, you can't assume that you're going to be able to organize that in a way that's satisfactory to the consumer. But they're comfortable with. And in a lot of cases, corporations use it as incentives, and it's working in many families' cases. Instead of replacing what we have, Michael Bennett and Tim Kaine have a far better approach to health care, and that is to have a public buy-in. If there isn't an adequate affordable health insurance, in other words, sufficient quality and affordability, if it isn't available, buy it through Medicare at the Medicare market rate, because Medicare doesn't charge a 20% profit premium. So you're going to get it at least at a 20% discount, and then you can negotiate on behalf of the Medicare population. So you can get those insurance rates pretty well down, but they're not subsidized. And that's a far more rational approach, what Tim has suggested, than doing what Elizabeth Warren has suggested. I just don't, I think she'd lose to Donald Trump, frankly. So that's why I say, unfortunately, I think that scenario could play out because she's going to win Iowa and New Hampshire. But Joe Biden will win South Carolina overwhelmingly, and then the big election will be Super Tuesday. So going back to the premise of your question, Mark, some of my view is shaped by my own personal political experience. In 1985, I ran as an independent against a 15-year incumbent, very popular mayor, Chuck Beatley, remember? And I had to set up my own campaign and so on. But what happened was that I was elected as an independent. I subsequently went back into the Democratic Party, of course. But I had 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And we got so much done. It was phenomenal. And when I think back, you know, when you look at the basis of the development of the waterfront and the King Street and so on and so forth, it was amazing. But I think that it was the dynamics that people are looking for. Because the Republicans knew their view was going to be well represented by 3 very thoughtful Republicans, Connie Ring, Marley Inman, and Bob Calhoun, for anybody that comes from Northern Virginia might recognize those names, and 3 thoughtful Democrats. They didn't go down to City Hall to go ballistic every Saturday at a public hearing. They thought, well, there's a certain tension there, and whatever they figure out, I'm going to be comfortable with it. And we were able to achieve enormous progress. I worry, and in fact, even in Alexandria, you know, it's now all Democrats. And I think we're going to overreach. You take things for granted. And it happens at the local, at the state, and at the national level. At the national level, the Democrats desperately need a thoughtful Republican opposition. For example, where are the Republicans when we come up with these big spending ideas? The Democrats are supposed to be the mommy party. You know, we're supposed to think about the social programs and so on. And then the Republicans get up and remind us what the debt is. How are you going to pay for this? That's not happening today. So we have a $1 trillion annual deficit. We've got $23 trillion of debt. We know that our kids are going to be paying more in interest costs on the debt that their parents incurred than they're going to be able to put into anything else, including defense. That's not good. It's not right. It's irresponsible. You know, when we'd get up and come up with a protectionist attitude because we need to protect organized labor and so on, Republicans would counter with the strength of the economy, the fact that we live in a global economy today, and so on. That tension is less likely to exist as we move into the future. And you could have an overreach at the state level. I really fear if the Democrats get the Senate and the presidency, there could be an overreach on the Democratic side, and at the local level, it can happen. We need that tension. Constituents want that tension. Unless you're really ideological, you want to hear the other side. I always want to hear the other side. If I come up with something, what are they going to say to find fault with what I'm proposing, because, I would oftentimes come up with some pretty idealistic legislation. And when you don't have that, when you have a president that says, I'm never going to touch entitlements, even though it's 3/4 of the budget and a lot of it is not being particularly well responsibly spent, when you have a president that's more isolationist than most of the Democrats, when you have a president that doesn't think twice about trillion-dollar annual deficits, I really worry about the direction that we're taking. So I think that overreach is a very serious issue, and it's going to continue to be. And because we have these two political tribes at odds with each other, that pendulum swings too far to the left and too far to the right. And the responsible person who wants to govern and to move forward in the right direction needs to try to keep that pendulum at some stable level.
Great. I got it, Jim. Yeah, I got one. There we go. We on? Yeah, thank you. So I think what I want to do now is leave time for questions from the audience for these two gentlemen. And I should remind that they got their political careers started in city and county government, right? A lot to learn about many of the issues that affect the national stage, having been, I think, in local politics. And I think there's many lessons that we can derive from what we're hearing right now, but also about their past service before they were members of Congress. So who would like to take the first question? Okay. Sure, yeah. And I'll just pass one back and forth here.
Thank you very much.
It's on.
Okay, thank you. Ann Malik from Albemarle. Our beloved Senator Greedies always talks about the balkanization of Virginia and the fact that we have so many big rural areas who I think more and more are feeling underrepresented, and that was certainly an accusation in my local race as well, where we have a big split in perspective. So do you have any solutions or optimistic ways we can try to reduce that balkanization?
Okay.
Well, here, as I said, everybody's listening to different news, they're getting their information different ways, and they have different worldviews. And, I've had dividing boards. I mean, people need to do more listening than talking sometimes. I had my niece, who was a summa cum laude graduate of Princeton. She's a professor at the University of Chicago, called me, "Oh, Uncle Tom, Trump's won, the world is going to end." And I said, "Look," I said, "what you need to do is figure out why people voted that way, and you need to talk to them." And I think we don't do enough of that. Votes are coming too easy for Democrats in urban areas and basically in college enclaves, with the exception of Liberty. And so what we're finding, which is a huge Republican, it's turned Lynchburg around. I'm the rector at George Mason. I think our precinct is probably the most Democratic precinct in the county. So we need to do more listening and more synthesizing on this. The problem is this: for 80% of the House of Representatives, for most members of the House of Delegates, the only race that counts is the primary. November is just a constitutional formality. And so people hew their time, their attention, their voting record to please their primary voters because they want getting reelected. The best illustration of this, really, if you look at the impeachment vote right now. I mean, I can make an argument on either side. I was there for Clinton. I felt he lied under oath. It's a felony. It's, that crossed the standard. Most Republicans did. Only 3 voted against it. Democrats said, well, it's bad, but it doesn't rise to the level of impeachment. Only 5 Democrats voted for impeachment. I think we can see the same thing this time, where it looks more like a no confidence vote than it does on the seriousness of whatever the issue is and how people perceive it. So we're sitting over there. It takes real leadership to sit down and talk to the other side and getting that trust back and forth. I found in Congress the hardest. I sponsored a bill to give the District of Columbia a voting seat in the House of Representatives. I actually got it through the House. It got killed in the Senate filibuster. When I left, the Senate passed it and the House couldn't get it through. But my initial problem was the liberal groups didn't trust me. I've been Republican campaign chairman 2 cycles, and they thought that this was a myth to steal a vote from them in Utah and everything else. And it took a year of conversation to get that trust. So we need to do more talking and more listening on this kind of things and work at maybe the low-hanging fruit of things we can do together to build that trust factor up. Because the media's business models are to reinforce those decisions every day. That's a business model. It's not serious news. These are entertainment business models, and they're successful.
Jim, you want to take that?
I don't disagree with anything Tom said on that point. So I'm going to address something else, take the opportunity to address something else. And that is the economic disparity throughout the state. We all know that, in fact, I've heard Tom express this more eloquently. You know, initially, when the people settled here, it had to be on water. You know, you had to have a port or a river, or there was no economy. And then it was the train. So if you lived near the train, you were going to be okay. And then Eisenhower built the interstate highway system, and if you were on a major highway, you were going to be okay. And then, of course, there's airports and so on. Rural areas are no longer going to be able to survive on agricultural business. Agribusiness has taken, there's just too, as I see it, there's too much monopolization of the agricultural industry. It's just not fair, and I can't get out of my mind that story that was in the front page of the Washington Post on Sunday. This poor guy's trying to make the farm work, and he's $180,000 in debt, and you know, as long as there's no trade agreement, they can't sell his products overseas, and he just gives up. There's no future. There's too many families like that are suffering. And similarly with manufacturing, it's going to be automated. There's very little manufacturing that can't be automated. So the next means of communication that has to be exploited in the other parts of the state that you know, are not economically thriving, it has to be computerization. The one thing that I would invest if I was in a more rural community is some kind of supercomputer center. And you know, focus on online sales. A lot of places are looking for warehouses. The land is relatively cheap. You've got vacant warehouses and even a small airport, because I think that's the only future. It's online commercial transactions and understanding the, you know, computerization, and particularly if you can get 5G, that's the future. And you know, I don't think it's healthy for everybody in every rural area, certainly the top 5 or 10% of the graduating high school class, to move to the city. You need them staying at home. And you know, it's contributing to this political, economic, and cultural divide in this country. We've got to find ways to keep those, you know, with our top students that have entrepreneurial ability, keep them home. And I hope that the state will find ways to subsidize, to incentivize spreading online connections so that we can spread broadband throughout the state to a better extent than we have today.
Other questions?
Gentlemen, can you hear me? What are your comments on outside money coming into the state? We just had a state election, not a national election. There were those who were going to nationalize it, pro or con. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on out-of-state money coming into Virginia. And it works the other way, out-of-state money goes into other states as well. Thank you.
Okay. Who wants to go first? All right.
Look, Virginia's races are nationalized because it's control of redistricting. I mean, that's really what motivates people. These outside money could care less about what happens in Virginia. You may have an interest group here or there that cares about, you got the gun thing, but it really boils down to political power and control at the national level. You know, I think, I know when my wife was in the Senate, she had a bill that 501c4s that come in are going to have to file their disclosure list if they come in. It's kept some of them out. But you still have these other groups that come in with massive amounts, and I don't think it's healthy for the state, but I don't know if the state wants to do anything about it. The one thing I found on campaign finance reform, I opposed McCain-Feingold, which basically eliminated soft money to parties and to candidates, and I said, well, that's great, but I said, where do you think this money's going to go? You think it's going to disappear? It's going to find its way back. We have a First Amendment. We have a series of cases going back to the Newbury case in the 20s and Buckley versus Vallejo and Citizens United that have basically allowed free speech rights for this. But no, we can regulate it in a better fashion. You're just asking the people who benefit from this to to do something about it. I think that's just unlikely to happen at this point. But no, Virginians ought to decide this. Missouri has some really strict laws in this case. You have a number of states that have taken action. So there, Montana, where they have taken action on this, and it would probably be a good thing. But because we were the focal point for control and redistricting and the like, we were awash in national money coming into the states. And look, it's easy for me to say as a Republican this time, because that money, by and large, benefited the Democrats this time. It could switch the next time around, and it's when you look at it objectively, you say this probably isn't a very good thing. The difficulty in politics is nobody ever looks at this objectively. When you talk about voter ID or felon voting, each side says, does this help me or hurt me? And those are basically, and we get lost in the argument over really what's the right thing to do, and all things being equal. You just don't hear those arguments anymore, even in the back rooms. It's, does this advantage me or not? And I've never known a political regime to write the rules in a way that disadvantages them. So that would be my comment.
And that has implications for the whole issue of redistricting, because now the Democrats have been talking about redistricting when they're the out party. They have the power to do something about it. Will they act against their own self-interest? Just a question. Okay. The original question, though, Jim, on outside money.
Yeah. Instinctively, I'd like to see there be some greater regulation of outside money, but practically, I'm not sure how you do it. And it could be one of those things that backfires on you. I guess you could look at what other states have done. But certainly in Northern Virginia, the Maryland to DC money, it just flows back and forth because people work in DC, they live in Maryland or Virginia. I think it'd be tough to regulate. There certainly was an enormous amount of money. I'll just give you a little anecdote, since I don't have a good answer for your question.
I appreciate his truthfulness.
I mean, it's troubling, but I just pragmatically, I'm not sure how we could do it, and make it stick and not possibly regret it after the fact. So I agreed to do a fundraiser for the state senate, and I got a call from Jennifer Boysko. None of this is confidential stuff, and Jennifer says, so Nancy would like to come to your house and be our guest. I said, oh, great, that'd be fun. So let's tell her that, yeah, I'm all in. So then I get so she says, Nancy wants to, I think it's her staff call, she says, Nancy wants to know how much you're going to be able to raise. I said, well, let's see, we can easily fit 100 people in the house, and so how about 200,000? And I'll hit the phones, and I'll try to, so I was pretty proud, I thought, that's a pretty good take. So I get a call from Nancy. I used to have her on my, Nancy Pelosi, I used to have on my contact list 75K, because that was the average she would ask when I was in the Congress. Every time she'd call me, at night or whatever, when she'd be fundraising, because she had to do it off the Hill, that was the average I had to fork up. So I would always, take the call with some trepidation. She says, Jim, so I see you're going to raise 200,000. But I'm coming, and I'm going to spend my whole night. I'm supposed to be having dinner, Paul and I, with Sherry Brown, but we're going to spend the night at your house. I think you can do better than 200, Jim. Oh, Madam Speaker, don't do this to me. She said, oh, I know you can do better than 200. So, all right, I'll get on the phone. Is 250 okay? She said, well, 250, 300, I think that would be more appropriate. I said, oh, God. So, of course, we call the caterer, we raise the catering fee, to get the valets and everything. I get on the phone, but I was stunned because it was the week before the election. It was like exactly 1 week. And the money that was available, so to reinforce Tom's point, people realized something was going to happen. Now, the numbers got skewed a bit because we had one very large donation from a corporation, which in Virginia you have much more liberal laws than virtually any other state. So one large corporate, the contribution for $250,000 came in. But even so, we raised $626,000. Holy smokes! Now, we couldn't fit the people in the house. The staff was keeping them out on the porch because everybody wanted to get a picture with Nancy. They had written checks for $10,000 or more. But I thought, holy smokes, we have reached a level here that I never, ever could have imagined. So this Virginia election, people were watching it, and they wanted to be part of it, and they could sense that something big was going to happen, and you know, it did. But I think that's too much money, frankly. And of course, you know, just an aside, Tom knows what that means. Next time I do bar that we have to hit, I don't ever want to have to raise that kind of money ever again in my life. It's too much money. But you know, you have it on both sides, and it's going to go back and forth. But I think we both, well, I don't know, I won't speak for Tom, but I think there's too much money involved in the political process today, frankly. And I wish we did have a campaign finance law, probably in Virginia, first of all, and nationally, that really created parameters that reduce the role of money in elections at all levels of government.
And can you help me raise money for scholarships for my students? I'll take half. Half that hall would be beautiful. So, all right.
Eric Gutschall from tiny little Arlington County. The question I wanted to ask, one of the things that's right, one of the things that I love about VACo, is so rewarding, is urban, rural, suburban, Democrat, Republican, Independent, no matter, everyone here seems very, very interested and dedicated to good governance. And so one of the things that I'd like to ask you about, though, where that seems to go out the window, not in this group on the local level, but certainly in terms of the national discourse, why is climate change such an extreme partisan issue?
All right, go for it.
Well, to a lot of us it wasn't. I was holding hearings on climate change in the House as a Republican, and nobody, but what's really happened is the Republican base has moved into West Virginia and the oil patch and places like that. Part of their base feels threatened by a conversation that starts up, we're going to stop coal and we're going to stop fossil fuels. And so they have dug in and become part of that financial base, part of that political base, and so it gives that coalition hesitancy to go out and attack part of their own base. I think that's what's happened. I remember, and you take a look at the politics. I mean, West Virginia was a solidly Democratic state 10 years ago, and what's happened to it? You know, Hillary Clinton didn't carry one county in West Virginia. Look at Southwest Virginia, Buchanan, and Wise. These counties used to be rock-ribbed Democratic counties. Now, it's not just climate change. I mean, part of it's the religious issue and the gun issue and everything else, but climate change is a big part of, and the way the coalitions have evolved at this point, it basically, I don't say it takes it off the table, but it makes Republicans more reluctant to eat their own on that debate. In my opinion, we ought to admit there's a problem. I mean, the data is pretty clear, but we don't have to start about we're going to close coal, we're going to close that, and then I think a lot of this can be done through, as we start more research and development and technology in terms of ways to attack this, and not start every sentence that we're going to close down the coal plants. But because I think that's a non-starter to some elements of the population. But it's a huge issue. But does that explain it? I mean, I think that's why you're seeing a hesitancy on the part of President Trump and others to eat his own political base.
Go add to that, Jim.
Only that there are so few coal jobs left in Virginia. You know, Terry McAuliffe understood that. He got a large donation from Tom Steyer because he took a strong position on climate change. It didn't hurt him at all. Most of coal mining has been so automated that it's really a handful of jobs, relatively speaking, compared to other industries. I do think that it's that our children and grandchildren are going to look back and decide that we were really irresponsible in not addressing the problem in a more comprehensive and determined way than we're addressing it today. California so far seems to be an indication of where the rest of the country is coming at albeit much later. But they've taken some very aggressive stances. It's the largest state in the union. They've had to, and they have overwhelming political support. I think you're going to see that level of support on the East Coast. And then the question is going to be whether it makes up a majority to take some strong action. Even China now is out of necessity, because you can hardly breathe in many days in China. And the cities in China, they're taking much more aggressive action than we are. And I think as a planet, we're going to have to make some sacrifices to try to at least stabilize the level of the global warming that's occurring as we speak. It really worries me what's happening in the Arctic with these icebergs melting, and you can see the level of the ocean rising, and it's the people who are poor and living along the shore and the islands in Asia that are going to be affected most dramatically. But they're going to have to move on. They're going to have to move inland, and they're going to have to live on other people's land that other people are living on now. It's going to cause some enormous strife and violence and disruption, and yet we're complacently sitting back and letting it happen.
I just think I think a bigger problem, I mean, you can always cope with rising sea level, is what's happening in the ocean. And you look at the acidity, and I think that's a larger problem on this that's got to be addressed long term. If we could all get together in a technological way and look at ways to solve it and agree there's a problem, instead of starting everything that we're going to eliminate jobs here. And there may not be a lot of coal jobs here, but the perception is in Kentucky and West Virginia, some of these states, Idaho, or where this is going, and of course in the oil patch, the Exxon pipeline, all these are part of that narrative at this point. And we don't do enough listening to each other. I mean, let's talk about the rapidity of change on the globe. That's really what's causing disruption across the globe. You look at Brexit in the United Kingdom, and you think our politics are dysfunction right now? Well, look at what's happening over there. And when change happens, in history, the law of relative deprivation says revolutions occur when things are getting better. Why? Because of rising expectations. So at the front end of the spear of change, people don't think it's fast enough and they're pushing for more change. At the rear end, people are worried about their status being threatened and have dug in, and it just has moved politics just way apart. And I think understanding it really takes leadership to try to bring everybody to the table and have a better understanding of it, and we're just not seeing this at this point. Point's well taken.
I think we've come to the end of our time, but I just want to leave with each of our panelists offering a final closing thought, something that makes you hopeful going forward.
I'll start. So I was there for TARP, and Jim was there for TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. We both voted for TARP. It's probably one of the most unpopular votes we ever cast. But my point is, with the economy spiraling down, sure, Wall Street bailout, I get the rhetoric and the sound bites and everything else, but every economist that I could talk to that I respected said, you got to do this or the thing becomes unwound and there's a run on the bank. And it took us 2 votes in the House, by the way, to pass it. We lost the first time. But in a crisis, we're not Greece. In a crisis, this country comes together. You'd like to be able to get ahead of the curve on some of these issues, but there's no reward in getting ahead of the curve. That's the problem. Voters don't reward, they tend to punish you on this. But in a crisis, we still operate pretty well together, unlike some other countries.
Something hopeful.
Well, so I've been involved in politics for, I guess, about 40 years now. And I have been surprised and pleased and heartened by the fact that local communities invariably find people who are willing to give up a substantial portion of their lives to serve in local government. They get very little pay, so it's certainly not the money. Maybe some of it is ego. I think most of it is that they want to live lives that matter. They want to have a purposeful life, and one that their children can look to with pride. And that continually happens, particularly at the local level, to some extent at the state level. By the time you get to the national level, there's a mix of ego and all kinds of other power and all kinds. But at the local level, it's amazing how in every community, when there's a need for leadership, people step up and do what's necessary. And you know, you look at a lot of communities around the world, and they don't have that kind of willingness to step up and lead. And that's the benefit of a democracy, an egalitarian democracy. And so the real strength of our society is it's really with people like yourselves. So Adams said to Jefferson in their last days, they died on the same days, as you know, and Jefferson was concerned, who will write our history? And Adams said, our history will be written by the people in the villages around the country who every day make decisions on behalf of their community. They are making history on a day-to-day basis, and we can die knowing I'm paraphrasing, that we have set up the foundation for this country to thrive on its democracy. And you know, I think, you know, whatever the crises we encounter, it's at the local level where people step up, stand out, speak out, that is going to make the difference.
So I'll make my one book plug because I study state and local politics, and my latest publication actually is called Federalism, a very short introduction. Oxford University Press has this book series called A Very Short Introduction to any subject in the world you want to learn about. It's kind of a fits in your pocket, an airplane book I call it. You can learn everything you need to know about a particular subject in one cross-continental flight or what have you. So if you have a chance to take a look at it, I'd be very proud. Spent a lot of time working on that. Thank you, Tom Davis and Jim Moran. I think this has been absolutely wonderful. We did a 4-hour road trip together yesterday, and
We're still friends.
And they're still friends, and we're going to do it again right now. So, yes, thank you for coming. And did you want to make final comments, please?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, too. What a wealth of knowledge and experience. And the bottom line is, we want to be good servants of the people. Amen? So let's give these gentlemen a big hand.